Hi everyone, my name is Tony Wynn, and this is my Module 2 project. So let's get started. So for my Module 2 project, we will be analyzing the outcasts in many different works of literature, and these works of literature are Hamlet, Prufrock, and the two paired selections. So first, what is an outcast? We have been learning about outcasts all semester, and there is a basic definition. An outcast is usually destined to be alone and a wanderer. They also create progress and change with their ideas. So let's examine the outcasts in these works of literature. And now, of course, an outcast is there is not a single definition for an outcast. There are many different ways an outcast is an outcast. So let's examine that. So the first piece of literature we're going to talk about is Hamlet, a famous play written by Shakespeare. And how was Hamlet an outcast? Hamlet was an outcast in several ways. First was his love. He fell in love with someone who was not royalty, which was strange back then because back then royalty only married royalty. This was why Polonius thought Hamlet was using Ophelia, because he did not believe he actually loved her and he thought he was just using her for sex. The second way Hamlet was an outcast was because he was so focused on his father's death. His father was murdered by his father's brother, or Hamlet's uncle, Claudius, and Claudius then became king. Claudius then married Hamlet's mom, Gertrude, and became Hamlet's stepdad. This unusual turn of events usually does not happen to royalty, especially having your father murdered. And the unusual situation that Hamlet was placed in made him an outcast. The third way that Hamlet was an outcast was because he was suicidal. Usually the prince in the story is supposed to be the happiest, and Hamlet wanting to take his own life was very unusual and different from other stories. So, let's talk about the literary criticism in Hamlet. So, for the historical criticism, Shakespeare has a bias on women. Women were not considered equal to men in that time period, so he was automatically writing with a bias. And this explains why Hamlet was sexist to Ophelia, his love interest. When he went through his mad stage and went crazy, calling her a whore and other demeaning things, Hamlet Shakespeare was writing from that time period. And there are also many biblical references in Hamlet. Claudius and Hamlet both committed the 7 deadly sins. In that period, if you committed those deadly sins, you were damned for eternity. And Shakespeare helps use the time period and this biblical reference to further portray both the characters as outcasts. And now for the new criticism in Hamlet. The play's main theme was revenge and deceit. So, when Hamlet says, "O God, Horatio, what a wounded name! Things standing thus unknown shall live behind me." Hamlet contemplates his life as he is about to die. He admits that he has sinned and deserves to die. He notes that he has lost everything important in his life: his family, his lover, and his kingdom. Another thing he said was to be or not to be. And this shows the eternal conflict that Hamlet suffers throughout the play when he decides whether or not to kill himself, because everything in the world is not what he expected it to be. So these two pieces of text from the literature help show that when you look deeper, the text has much more meaning. So now let's talk about Prufrock. There are many ways that make Prufrock an outcast. One is his fear of ineptitude. He was so afraid to be judged throughout the poem, he basically never did anything. Another was his lack of time. He never had any time to do anything, so nothing ever got accomplished. A third thing that made Prufrock an outcast was his self-doubt. He was in paralysis and could not make decisions. He was always questioning the small things. And this helps relate the poem to Hamlet, because Hamlet also suffered from self-doubt when deciding if to get revenge on Claudius. And the fourth thing that made Prufrock an outcast was his fear of failure. He constantly felt he was going to mess something up, and that is why he kept asking himself, "Do I dare? Do I dare?" And these 4 traits makes Prufrock an outcast because it makes him stand out from normal people. He basically could never get anything done because he was too scared of failure, he was too self-conscious, and his inaction paralyzed him. So let's look at the literary criticism. So the historical criticism of Prufrock. The themes of Hamlet and Prufrock are very similar. They overlap. Just like Hamlet, Prufrock could not have made a choice, could not make a choice, and lived his life in self-doubt. T.S. Eliot, who wrote Prufrock, was also very depressed when he wrote this poem. There was an article published saying Eliot had lost his secret lover when he was writing these poems, and that might have to do with the depressing themes. So, because Eliot was depressed when he wrote Prufrock, Prufrock was depressed in the poem. So this historical context could have a big effect on the poem. So now let's look at the new criticism. So something Eliot wrote in Prufrock was, "No, I was not Prince Hamlet, nor was I meant to be." By including this in the poem, Eliot is drawing comparison to Hamlet, even though Prufrock tells the reader not to. Prufrock is not Hamlet because Hamlet eventually does follow through with his action in the story. So this one piece of literary text from the poem shows that when you deeply analyze it, it goes deeper into Prufrock's inaction. So now let's move on to the paired selections. So the 2 paired selections I chose were An Army Corps on the March by Walt Whitman and The Night March by Herman Melville. So the first poem, The Army Corps on the March, this poem has a very aggressive diction and no rhyme scheme. So let's talk about the new criticism. You can see Whitman was writing about the brutal and violent life of a daily soldier, so basically the daily tribulations of war. The diction and imagery in the poem allow the reader to see that war is awful and no one would want it. So basically, the new criticism of An Army Corps on the March is the diction and imagery written by Whitman cause the reader to see deeper into the depressions and horrors of war. So let's look into the historical criticism. Walt Whitman was actually a nurse in the Civil War. This experience from the author helps influence his writing because he is writing about his own experiences. He has actually experienced war. So this definitely helps make the story more realistic because of the historical context. Whitman has been in the war. So the other paired selection was The Night March by Herman Melville. This poem has very wistful diction, and although it seems like it was describing war, it spoke of it very nicely. So let's first go over the new criticism. So even though this poem seems like it was talking about war, it was actually talking about the stars in our galaxy. Once carefully reading the lines of the poem, you can see the author is not actually describing war. This helps to explain his diction, which is not very violent. So now let's go over the historical criticism. So the historical context of this time period, some people were questioning religion. So during this time, many people were questioning the existence of God, and this is what the poem is describing, whether God and the stars exist. So because of the time period led to the topic of the poem, and Melville disguised it as an army marching, when he's actually questioning the existence of God. So let's talk about the outcasts in both these paired selections. Both of them do show an outcast. In Whitman's poem, the army and the men fighting are considered the outcast. The men were living in a society where not everyone was a soldier, so often their experiences could not be related towards for other people. This often led them to be ostracized and considered outcasts from their society. Because of the horrors the soldiers saw at war, and that they could not talk to everyone about it, they were often considered outcasts. In Melville's poem, Melville is considered the outcast. His poem questions the existence of God and the stars. Although some people were beginning to question the existence of religion, most people in this time period were firm believers. This difference in thought and opinion leads to Melville being the outcast. So because not everyone was questioning religion, Melville was considered an outcast, and his poem was actually met with a lot of fury from the religious community. So this concludes my Module 2 project. Thank you so much for listening.